Hello geographers, welcome to your Cat Help session for this week. You've got a 20-mark question to answer this week about volcanic hazards versus storm hazards. If we have a look at the question specifically, it says volcanic hazards will always have a greater impact than storm hazards. So we are comparing those two. Note that it says always have a greater impact. To what extent do you agree with this view? So if we think about a logical structure to answer this question, within our introduction, we want to make sure that we're unpicking some of the key terminology. So for example, what are the main volcanic hazards we associate with eruptions? What are the main storm hazards that we associate with tropical storms? So give a brief outline of the sorts of hazards that occur, and then go on to state your opinion about the extent to which or how much you agree with that view. Do you partially agree? Do you agree to some extent? Do you strongly agree or agree to a large extent? Remember that you should come down on one side or the other of that argument. Don't sit in the middle, but equally don't completely agree or disagree. Make sure that you have a little bit of nuance in your response. Moving on then to think about the overall structure of the main body of your essay. There are a number of ways you could structure this. So you could look at different types of impacts, so social, economic, environmental, but probably the most logical way of doing it is to think about arguments for and arguments against that statement. Now, I've written a number of different arguments here that you might develop, but it depends on what your viewpoint is as to how many arguments you might put forward for or against this viewpoint. So for example, if you were arguing in support of that statement that volcanic hazards do have more impact than storm hazards, then you might have more arguments for than you would do against that statement, and vice versa if you were arguing it the other way around. So if we think about what arguments we could make that would support the idea that volcanic hazards are more impactful, we could think about the unpredictability of volcanic activity. So for example, phreatic eruptions are very hard to predict, but having said that, storms we can predict or monitor or forecast many days in advance. So we could make that point about predictability. We could think about how volcanic hazards can trigger other hazards. So tsunami, for example, can be triggered by the explosive eruption or triggered by a landslide associated with volcanic activity. Some good examples of that recently in Indonesia that you might want to draw upon. We could consider that while we might be able to evacuate people from volcanically active areas in advance of an eruption, we can't prevent the economic losses. And we might also be able to make the point that volcanic activity can have impacts far beyond the point where the eruption has occurred. So the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull, for example, that's a really good example to use to show how volcanic activity and volcanic hazards can have impacts far beyond the point of origin. So farmers in Kenya, for example, being unable to export their crops to Europe because of the ash cloud closing the airspace. Whatever you do within your arguments, make sure that you are supporting those points and arguments with evidence and examples. Eyjafjallajökull is the main example that we have studied, but you will need to probably draw upon other examples of volcanic eruptions that you have studied. Turning our attention then to the arguments against this statement, we can think about how storms might cause more impact than volcanic hazards. So we could think about storm surges and their unpredictability and how difficult they are to manage in relation to some volcanic hazards. We could think about the scale of these events. So storms tend to affect possibly a larger area than a volcanic eruption might do. And we can also maybe think about the frequency. So storms tend to occur much more often than some volcanic eruptions. So particularly volcanic eruptions at destructive plate boundaries have very long periods of dormancy between eruptions. However, storms can happen several times in 1 year. There's a lot going on in the news at the moment about the Philippines and how they've been hit by lots of storms in a very short space of time. So again, as we said before, make sure you're supporting your points for your arguments against that statement with some evidence and some examples. Then you want to move on to your conclusion. So you want to think about trying to summarise the arguments for and against, putting forward what you think the main argument is that supports or disputes that statement, depending on where you're going with your viewpoint. Make sure that you restate your viewpoint, make sure that you are directly addressing the question and tell me to what extent you agree or disagree with that statement. Is it to a large extent, to a small extent? And there's the possibility here to add a twist into your conclusion, or to again add that idea of nuance to your argument. So does it depend on, for example, the scale of the eruption or the storm? Is it determined by other factors that you might be able to think of that could influence the severity of the impacts? So there's an opportunity there to show that you understand the complexities of these sorts of arguments. Remember that you need to be comparing and contrasting throughout that answer. So you want to be drawing out some of the similarities and differences of the way that storms and volcanic eruptions have an impact on people. Make sure though you are not just giving descriptive accounts of individual events. So don't just write long descriptive passages about what happened in the Eyjafjallajökull eruption or what happened in Typhoon Haiyan. Make sure you're just cherry picking bits of evidence from those examples and using that evidence to support your points. Just a final reminder as well about the amount that we should be writing for these sorts of questions. If you're handwriting it, a minimum of 2 sides of A4 handwritten. If you're typing it up, 1 side of A4 typed up in a relatively small font, so a size 11 font, for example, not a size 18 font. Hopefully that gives you some pointers about where you want to start with this question. Definitely think about your opinion of that viewpoint before you start writing it, so that you know where you're going within that answer.